What is up, everybody? Welcome back to yet another Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation in the novel series analysis. We are on Volume 5, Chapter Interlude, Eris the Goblin Slayer. I have read a couple chapters up ahead, but we'll see how far I can get into this. As usual, I'm just kind of going chapter by chapter, and based on the feedback that I got last episode, which I greatly appreciate the feedback, by the way, seems like most people just kind of want me to keep going as I'm going, and I feel most comfortable that way, so why not? Everybody's like, don't skip anything. I'm like, I'm not going to skip anything. I'm just trying not to be as word for word of the chapter itself, trying to figure out areas where I can sort of cut a lot of the fat out. But again, everybody's just way too afraid of me skipping anything. So I guess I'll just keep as is and we'll see where things go. But again, I do want to emphasize, I greatly appreciate the feedback. The encouragement and everything is just, it means so much to me, guys. I cannot express that enough. But yeah, with all that said, let's get into this. Let's get into Eris' chapter. I kind of stated in my last video, but yes, this chapter is really, really fantastic, mainly around the idea of getting more emphasis into the world of the Millis Church, the knights themselves. But additionally, I got a lot more clarification on who this Cliff guy is. It didn't seem like the anime adaptation of this particular chapter did it much justice. I think there's a certain aspect of it that I'll get into later that was... I don't remember it in the anime, honestly. But yes, opening up this chapter, we have the introduction of Cliff Grimoire. In the current time, he is currently 12 years old, but we get a little backstory of Cliff. As a young child, he resided in an orphanage that was actually run by the Millis Church. This meant that they had a lot of good funding, it's well taken care of. It was sort of a symbol of the Millis Church. After several years, he was adopted at the age of 5 by Harry Grimoire. And Harry Grimoire was a high-ranking member of the Millis Church itself. Following this, he underwent a lot of rigorous training and education programs that sort of nurtured his talents. And in a few short years, he achieved advanced rank healing, detoxification, divine strike magic. He was intermediate rank in all disciplines of offensive magic, as well as advanced tier in fire magic. He was a prodigy, he was constantly praised, he was seen as somebody who would one day make his mark upon the world. Yes, it sort of parallels Rudeus' life. This idea of somebody that is so good at what he does and receives so much praise for what he does, but as they kind of specify in the novel, unlike Rudeus, he doesn't have his past life to sort of keep him from getting arrogant. Rudeus had this previous life where he was struggling and he was a shut-in and he had all these terrible experiences he went through, and that kind of helped Rudeus keep his mind calm. Whereas, yes, for Cliff, being somebody just born in this world, Duke gets full of himself really quickly. And this was kind of seen with his instructors. With few people around him that were better than him, yes, some able to cast, Saint tier healing magic or Master Saint tier detoxification, nobody was as good as him in all the areas that he was, so Cliff eventually just stopped listening to his tutors. But that doesn't mean he was free to do what he wanted. There was expectations placed upon Cliff at an early age. It was expected of him that at some point he would kind of replace his father, his foster father, in his position at the church. However, Cliff didn't want this. He wanted to be an adventurer. And the reason because of this was his time at the orphanage itself. A lot of the time you would have adventurers come by and visit the orphanage. And this is because the kids at the orphanage, if they didn't get adopted out by the age of 10, they were kind of started training and whatnot to become adventurers instead. The only exception to this was people that had superb skills, they would kind of be shipped off to be knights. But yes, these kids that became adventurers would eventually come back because they wanted to see their old home, and they would want to see their old teachers that were at the orphanage. And they would tell these great tales of their adventures. So yes, Cliff, like many other children there, became captivated by these tales, despite the fact that he knew that eventually this wouldn't be his role, this wouldn't be his destiny. But no, he decided one day, look, I'm done. I don't want this to be my destiny. I want to be an adventurer. So he decides to sneak out and go to the Adventure Guild. Of anything, he just had a desire to actually use his skills and enjoy his time while he's young. With staff in hand and a blue robe that he bought, he goes into the Adventure Guild and signs up. Though he registered at the Adventure Guild as a magician, knowing that if he were to register as a healer, it would probably be easier for the church itself to track him down. And knowing that magicians are kind of high on demand, he knew that this would be a good way for him to get into a party really easily. Figuring that with his abilities, rank isn't even an issue, but it still ends up being an issue, as party after party just completely denies him. Most of them just saying, look, our rank is too far apart. He just joined, his rank's too low. A lot of these people are like, no, you can't join us, your rank's too low. But yes, with his hot-headedness, you should be grateful that I, as good as I am, would be willing to join your party, which completely ticks people off. Yes, eventually getting to the point where one adventurer snaps back at him, grabs him by the collar. But Cliff thinks this is an opportunity, if anything. If people keep rejecting him, if I can beat this guy at close range at that, the swordsman, it would prove that I'm really skilled. But yes, just before he just acts on this. A certain girl shows up. Eris, the Goblin Slayer. Yes, now at this point, it kind of stops, and we go back to find out how Eris got to this point. Yes, she just left the inn, told Rudeus that she's going to be going out Goblin Slaying that day because it's their day off for Dead End. She chose not to wear her typical hoodie that she got from Rudeus because mainly a lot of people keep mistaking her to being a mage, and that always turns into some sort of conflict. But yeah, she arrives at the Adventure Guild. Again, this is the one this is like the headquarters. This thing is huge, 2-story building. It kind of points out the idea that most adventurers, when they arrive here, would probably be shocked and in awe of how great this is. But Eris goes out of her way, just kind of like, no, doesn't affect her at all. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's an A-rank adventurer. She's a veteran in here. She checks all the jobs on the bulletin when she enters. Specifically, she looks into the E-rank quests and looking for specifically an open quest. These are high priority quests that are actually posted by the country itself, which it goes out of its way to kind of point out here that this is something that's kind of non-existent in the Demon Continent. Obviously, because with the Demon Continent, there's no countries to post this stuff. But yeah, she eventually finds one. Quest open, exterminate goblins, 10 Millis copper coins per ear, client the Holy Knights of Millis. And it specifically says on there, do not remove this request. Instead, simply bring the ears to the front counter. Sort of meaning that this is something that's kind of remaining there so that multiple people can take on this job. As long as you get ears and come in, you get paid. It's not like the typical where you take the quest and it's removed from the board because you don't want somebody else following up behind you and trying to do the same quest that you're doing. At this point, it gets into talking about the goblins themselves. They mostly live between the forest and the open plains. Obviously, they're humanoid shape and they carry crude weapons. They also can't comprehend human speech. And in small numbers, they're kind of harmless, but if left alone for too long, they would reproduce rapidly, and they would attack nearby villages. And while their presence is somewhat dangerous, they're kind of left to be. They sort of create a natural buffer between the most dangerous and the people of the area. But again, they're weak enough that most young men and women can actually kill them. And because of this, the Adventure Guild sort of takes advantage of this. They regularly put up goblin extermination tasks for many members to actually join in, with some kind of mildly generous rewards. It's sort of an introduction to combat quests. It also notes here that something that even Eris herself doesn't know is that the Millis Church actually uses goblins. It's sort of a torture tool to use against foreign spies. So they actually don't make a full-on effort to completely exterminate them, sort of keeping their population stable, which makes me wonder what they're doing to use them as torture. Maybe we'll find that out later. I don't know, my mind immediately went to Goblin Slayer, and I'm thinking, what are they doing with them? Or Peter Grill. Here's where we actually get an explanation as to why Goblin Slaying. Like, we don't really get a full sense. Yeah, Eris was, like, super excited to take on Goblin Slaying. It was like, in the anime, it's like, okay, she really badly wants to specifically kill goblins, which is kind of weird. So again, they're kind of pointing out the fact that this is an E-rank quest. These things are really easy. She can probably mop the floor with them. Why goblins? But yes, it kind of explains that Eris has had this dream for a long time. It was kind of implanted into her head when she was having her very brief existence in and attending a school. She listens to the boys talking about in class about how they plan on becoming adventurers and that they want to start off by hunting down goblins. And after gaining a little bit of strength and a little bit of money, they would then head out to the southern central continent to take on higher rank quests, and then dive into the labyrinths. Piquing her curiosity, eventually she tried to join in the conversation. That didn't end well. She ended up getting in a fight. She beat them all up, gets kicked out. But then, of course, later on becomes under the tutelage of Ghislaine, which at that point kind of re-sparked that yearning for adventure. Later, of course, she would meet Rudeus, and she would constantly be dreaming the entire time about this one moment the two of them, this two-party adventurers, would go out, one swordsman, one mage, tackling challenges and digging into labyrinths, looking for treasures and all sorts of adventure. However, and this is where it kind of is a downer, however, the moment they actually got transported to the Demon Continent, she sort of realized Rudeus' true nature. He's very businesslike. He's always focused on the party and safety, always avoiding labyrinths. She knew that he would just never go for killing goblins, even though this is something that's always been kind of her dream. Now, unfortunately, the second reason for why she wants to kill goblins so bad is apparently a secret. After noting this posting, she eventually notices another posting. It says, displaced citizens of Fatoa region, please contact the following address. And she notes here that, oh, I've seen this at Zantport as well. She noted that Rudeus never really spoke about the Fatoa region. She just kind of assumed that he believed that it would make her anxious if he ever spoke about it. Kind of assumed this was the reason why he wanted the day off in the first place, was to address this. And it kind of goes out of its way to note that Eris tried to not think about any of the complicated problems in their travels. She kind of convinced herself that she wasn't smart enough to understand them. She left Rudeus to do the thinking. She figured that once the time came that he had a plan set out, they would sit down and she would follow it. Which, yes... Okay. I kind of let out this long sigh when I read this because yes, as for those that have been following my videos, I was talking up Eris like crazy. Not that this is a bad thing, to be honest. I kind of figured that Eris had figured it out the moment they transported. Not that it took until they got like the Xant port before she seen a posting and said, oh, Rudeus probably seen this. I'll let him figure it out. It wasn't really so much that she was like overly thinking it and figured out that, well, this light came from over here and we got teleported, so other people probably got teleported. She didn't really kind of think all that stuff through, but I still give her credit. She noticed it. She thought about it. She assumed that Rudeus had it figured out. She let it be. But it kind of just, again, steps on my thought process that she's some kind of genius. Not really a genius, but that she was at least smarter than Rudeus about this situation. But whatever, y'all. I know I've seen a couple comments saying that, yeah, not that grand, but whatever. But it still goes to the point. She's not stupid. And I think that there is a sense sometimes in even watching the anime that Eris kind of seems very simple-minded, but she's not really. Which is what I was so excited about with reading this particular chapter. It's the first time we ever get any sort of inner thought. Not necessarily inner thought, but at least inner decision-making that Eris is having. Which is sort of disappointing because I was hoping to actually have some real solid inner dialogue. It really does seem like this entire chapter is more of a third-person into her mind look. Not a first-person perspective of Eris, you know, going around and doing this stuff and thinking about things and getting frustrated with things. It really does feel like somebody is reading her mind and explaining what she's thinking, which again, kind of disappointed about. But yeah, this is the point in which we kind of merge these two stories. Cliff is fighting with some guys, Eris notices it, and she steps in there and intervenes. It knows specifically that she sees that he's carrying the staff. It looks like it's quite expensive, but she's noting the idea that it's not as expensive as something like Aqua Hartia. Kind of assumes that he's from a wealthy family, but not as wealthy as Eris' own family. But yes, Eris intervenes, says, stop, you're being childish. Eris kind of found this kind of thrilling. Like, she's stepping in here, she feels like the veteran, the one that steps in and stops these children from fighting over dumb things. It made her feel good. Kind of notes the idea that Rudeus himself would probably be shocked about how mature she's being. Typically, she's the one starting those fights. But yes, surprisingly and sort of anticlimactically, the guy just kind of steps down. Says, yeah, you're right. After this, she kind of stands there with a smile and waiting for her gratitude from this boy. And yes, it doesn't come. He just says, who asked for your help, huh? I could have handled those thugs just fine with my magic. Don't stick your ugly nose, ugly nose in where it doesn't belong. To which, yes, he's immediately unconscious because she just slugs him and knocks him out. Which is kind of funny because the fact that those guys just left, they still returned to save him from being killed by Eris. Otherwise, he probably would have been missing some sort of other piece of his anatomy. Because, you know, Eris loves to go right after that target. Following this, we cut to the front gates of Milshin, where we have Eris heading out for her Goblin Slaying. And yes, after regaining consciousness, Cliff chases after her and confronts her. Quickly apologizes and thankful for the fact that she's less angry now. She doesn't immediately turn and slug him again, but he introduces himself. My name is Cliff Grimoire. She replies saying Eris, opting not to say dead end, just because of the situation, and didn't really want to put a bad stain upon the name of Dead End. He says, wonderful name. You're a swordsman, right? Would you form a party with me? And yes, she struggles to resist to punch him again, says, no thanks, and leaves. But he still follows her and says, okay, that's fine. I'll at least let me support you from range. Everyone says I'm a budding sage. I'll definitely be useful. He continues about how you'll never find another spellcaster as amazing as me, Eris. I'm even better than your average A-rank magician. Which this, obviously, because of how much she likes Rudeus, completely ticks her off. Again, to her, technically, the most amazing magician in the world is Rudeus. Even Majord acknowledged Rudeus' skills. While he is, yes, an A rank, there's nothing averaged about him. But she still says, fine, follow me. This is where we cut to them actually, I don't know, you want to call it Goblin Slaying? They are dying. Them out in the battlefield, and there's just this big waves of flame. They're just completely incinerating the goblins at once. Cliff is toting about how pretty amazing, right? But yes, as Eris is looking at these corpses, obviously knowing the fact that they're just completely burnt to crisp, there's no ears to obtain. But no, she offers her opinion. You think? No, I can't say that I'm impressed. Which in Eris' mind is much more of a complicated decision of opinion than you might think. Yes, he used advanced rank Exodus Flame, but that's something that Rudeus can cast. But unlike Cliff, Rudeus is able to cast it without that lengthy incantation that Cliff is having to do. And additionally, Rudeus' spell was much more powerful. But the deeper point is that Rudeus would never really use that in that situation. Instead, he would opt to use a spell that would kill without damaging the ears. And what's more, Eris had to keep them occupied while he did the incantation, and he would never warn her, so she was nearly caught up in it. Rudeus would never do that. Rudeus would never put her in danger like that. Which, yes, to give a little more extra perspective here, if you remember way back when Rudeus was first training as a party with Rejered and Eris when they first arrived at the Demon Continent, this was something that was definitely fresh in Rudeus' mind. He had these abilities that he was using, but the thing that was sticking in Rudeus' head is that he was fearful that if his spells were too powerful and they accidentally hit Eris, it would really harm her. So he went out of his way to figure out a method that he'd be able to support without putting her in danger. In response to this, Cliff goes off about, oh, you just don't know much about magic, do you, Eris? There's so many kinds of spells, and he goes on to this long lecture about spells, explaining that it's an advanced tier, and that there's so many adults that just can't understand it because it's too complex, and they're so incapable of casting it. But this is all information that Eris already knows. She's learned all this stuff from lessons from Rudeus. But, unlike Glyph, again, Rudeus was so much better, like 10 times better of explaining all this stuff, so that she could understand it. So he follows it up with, now do you understand how amazing I am? And Eris so badly wanted to punch him. So badly wanted to punch him. I think I got a sense of that in the anime adaptation, but it's like, what is this? We're on count like 5 now. We've only punched once, but we have 5 now that we want to do. It was more of a fact that this guy is literally ruining this long-awaited day that she could go goblin slaying. Again, this is something that she's dreamed of ever since she was in school. Ever since she was, learning under Giselaine, ever since she got transported, this whole time she always desired this one moment she could go out killing goblins and this dude screwing it up. So instead of punching him, she decides to cross her arms like she usually does and says, okay, I've got enough. You're not going to be much help here. You can leave now. To which Cliff is like, yo, what, are you serious? There's no, you were struggling so much to kill those goblins. There's no way I can leave you out here. To which, yes, finally, the 6th time she punches him again. So he's got 2 for 4 now. He quickly goes to heal his nose. His nose is bleeding, so he quickly goes to heal it and says, what was that for? To which she clicks her tongue. It was obvious that she went easy on him. Like, she didn't punch him as hard as she could. She didn't want to leave this unconscious dude just sitting out in a field in the middle of nowhere. Ready to hit him once again, Cliff kind of stops her and says, look, let's go in the forest for a while. You're obviously strong. Let's go in the forest for a little while. There I can demonstrate my real value as a mage. We'll just find a whole bunch of goblins and I'll show you. It kind of points out here that Cliff, in doing this, he has no sinister motives here. It's not that he has a crush on Eris at this point. It was more a fact that he just really wanted to show off his power. He wanted to revel in how powerful he was. But Eris is apprehensive about this. She's been told countless times over and over again by specifically Rudeus, but also Rejered, to never go into the forest. Deep in the forest, there's very dangerous monsters in there. We've kind of already hit on this. I mean, we've explained it with Buena Village and the forest outside there. Deeper in the forest was the higher concentration of, monsters that were manipulated by mana. And additionally, yes, technically the petrified forest. Like, the further they went in there, that stuff got super dangerous. It's something that, again, Rudeus and Rejered were very clear on avoiding them. And she trusted their judgment. She didn't want to go against what they were saying. She trusted them. But yes, Cliff plays on Eris's weakness. Surely you're not scared, Eris, right? So yes, with her pride, says, yes, all right, whatever, we'll go. Going in there, they're just taking down monsters left and right. Eris is just cutting down D-ranked monkey monsters called Uton. At the same time, Cliff's like, yeah, there's nothing in here that's a match for me. He's using his wind magic, intermediate wind magic to take them out. But at some point, Eris stops, says, oh. And Cliff coming up with this big smile on his face, well, what's wrong, Eris? With her grimace, she turns, folds her arms like she usually do, plant her feet all wide like she normally does, sticking her chin up in the air and saying, tell me something. Were you keeping track of our route here? Cliff's like, no, not really. She's like, oh, I see. So we're lost then. And Cliff at that point, his face just goes pale. Though Eris at the same time was keeping her composure. As a woman of the Grey Rat family, she kept her cool. Though she didn't know how she was going to explain this whole situation to Rudeus and Rejered. Being lost in the forest, the place where she was told not to really go to. So she says, Cliff, just shoot yourself up in the sky up there and see which way the city is. And he's like, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? I can't do that. She's like, well, Rudeus can do it just fine. He's like, Rudeus, who the heck is Rudeus? She's like, my tutor. He's like, what? With this, Eris is just like, whatever. She gave up on arguing it. She thought about Giselaine and what she taught her in a situation like this. Oh, of course, we can gather branches and we can start a fire and that can send a signal, but who would see it? Reserve and Rudeus had business. They're not looking for us. So with that, she folds her arms again and began to scowl and just kind of close her eyes and really thought carefully. Gisane said that in times like this, it's critical to stay calm and think, especially when you're in the point where you're feeling anxiety. It's the most important point to really just calm yourself and think. She wouldn't allow herself to panic. So Cliff asks, what are we going to do, Eris? And she says, well, there's probably adventurers nearby. So he's like, right, so we should go ask for help. With this said, Cliff decides to start running off, and then he realized that Eris wasn't budging. Thinking on what Reserve taught her, he decided to stay still, not move, and consciously sharpen her senses. She didn't have a third eye, but she did have ears and a nose. She can also feel the flow of magical energy in the area. Yes, she's still inexperienced at doing this, but it's just enough. She's been training every day for this. Cliff inquires, and she's like, be quiet. Listening, she can hear the rustling, she can hear monsters moving around, she can hear the buzz of the insects, and something in the distance, the sounds of combat. So with that, she rushes towards it. Cliff asks, how'd you do that? She's like, I just sharpened my senses for a while. Cliff's like, what, did your teacher teach you that too? And she's like, wait, what are you talking about? Yes, I guess Reserve's my teacher. Yes, my teacher taught me that. I think that's one of those moments where he's talking about Rudeus, and she's like, yeah, I guess, yeah, Reserve did teach me. And yeah, she kind of knows to herself that, yes, technically Reserve hasn't taught her as many things as, say, Ghislaine, but she still believes that he is her teacher. You kind of get a sense of that throughout this entire chapter. Like, there's so much emphasis on here of people that taught Eris and people that she really, truly respects. Each one of them that taught her something that ultimately she will choose to use in her survival. Again, Rudeus, what would Rudeus do? Again, what did Reserve say? I'll do what Reserve said. Oh, this situation, this is perfect. This is exactly what Ghislaine told me about. She's constantly thinking about these people that she looked up to that were her masters. These important figures in what molded her and the skills that she has. It really puts an emphasis on what all she's learned over this time. She's really grown. But yeah, he says, this Rudeus must be something special. And she's like, oh, yeah, Rudeus? Yeah, Rudeus is incredible. That's when they arrive at where this combat is happening. They notice that at the edge of the forest, there is this carriage that is tipped over. She immediately pulls Cliff and shoves his face down to the ground. There was 6 total people still on their feet, and there was 1 armored and helmeted knight. This armored knight standing with her back against this tree, sword drawn, and the other 5 were men that were cloaked in black, and they were all positioned circling the knight. She could see that there was 3 other corpses nearby that were all in the same armor as the knight. And despite it seeming like things were so weighed against this knight wasn't fleeing. Looking closer, Eris could notice that there was a young girl that was cowering behind the tree where the knight was standing. She noticed that she was full of terror and covered in tears. Cliff nearby noted, that armor, that's a temple knight, Eris. And the entire time, Eris's heart is just pounding. She knew who the Temple Knights were. This is where we get an explanation of Millis's holy military orders. We had the elite cathedral knights who were entrusted with matters of national defense. Then we had the missionary knights that were dispatched abroad as sort of a mercenaries of sorts. This is so that they might spread the teaching of the Millis Church and demonstrate its power at the same time. Then we had the temple knights who were much feared with their infamous inquisitors. These ones were tasked with stamping out heresy. And the way to kind of identify each one of them, you had the cathedral knights wore white, the missionary knights wore silver, and the temple knights wore cerulean. And at this point, we're noting that this knight was clearly wearing blue. There was no room for doubt here. This temple knight group was ambushed. At this point, they can hear this knight yelling out, "You fools, don't you know who this lady is?" Which, yes, the guys around her is pretty much like, yes, we know exactly who she is. "Then you seek to harm her. You must be lackeys of the Pope then." At this point, Eris couldn't really make sense of what the conversation is. All she really knew is that these black-clad men were trying to kill this terrified girl. So with that said, she reaches for her sword. Cliff's like, what are you thinking of doing? We can't get mixed up in this. That girl's a blessed child who's supposedly a potential future Pope. That means that those men are obviously the current Pope's personal assassins. They're so well trained and ruthless, even I couldn't stand a chance. Again, Cliff thinking he's the greatest thing in the world. But no, Eris didn't even think about why Cliff even knew this much. There was only one thing in her mind. She had to do something, or that girl was going to die. She was a member of Dead End, and they would never let something bad happen to a child. And specifically, she would never be able to step before Reserve ever again. And on top of that, she'd seen so many times where Rudeus would put himself in danger for the same reasons. Again, putting so much emphasis on how much she respects these people and how she wants to follow exactly what they did. But yeah, Cliff's like, no, let's just stay quiet. And she's like, no, we can't. We've already been noticed. She noticed that one of the black-clad men took note of them when she first brought Cliff down. Either way, she didn't know what they were going to do after they finished killing these two, but she couldn't stand the chance. So yeah, with that said, she says, look, stay here. And she rushed out there with pretty much Cliff saying, no, stop. But yeah, this is the point in which Eris just goes in there and absolutely wrecks these guys. Quickly bringing out her sword. They try to scatter, but she quickly is like, too slow. cuts one directly in half, going from one shoulder all the way down to the side. This was the advanced tier sword god style silent sword. Being so trained with Ghislaine and Rejered, her skill was so polished. And this is important. Totally didn't realize this in the anime, honestly. This is technically Eris's first kill. First time she ever drew her sword and brought it through somebody and killed somebody was this kill here. Completely clean through him in half, and she didn't even falter for a minute. Her focus quickly shifts to the next target. They try to surround her, but her steps were too fast, hitting heavy on this idea that Rejered always taught her specifically never to allow herself to get surrounded, and what best ways to sort of move herself so that she can avoid that. The idea was to quickly pick off your targets quickly, similar to monsters themselves. Pick them off quickly so that they can't encircle you. It kind of notes here that the men were becoming unnerved. Her attacks and her movements were just so out of the norm, and her attacks just came from unexpected angles. Because of this, it was kind of impossible for these assassins to both dodge her attacks and at the same time focus on attacking. Two of them leapt towards her, kind of staggering their attacks on purpose. They were fast, but specifically not as fast as Rejered. And yes, she's been training with Rejered for a long time now. That's when the knight nearby screams out, "Be careful, their daggers are coated with poison," as she jumps forward and swings at one of the assassins from behind. Eris, anticipating how the assassin would react to her attack, allows her to kind of break from their encirclement. And with this, her next strike cuts right through one of the assassins. With this, the remaining two assassins decide to retreat. But Eris, not one to leave the job undone, decides to chase down one of them, attacks him from behind, and completely disembowels him. But unfortunately, this last remaining assassin gets away. With the calming of the fight itself, Eris quickly snorts in disdain, swipes the blood off her blade, and from the outwards appearance, she seems calm. But inside, her heart is still pounding. She just experienced her first life and death encounter with human beings. It's finally hitting her. For the first time, Eris had killed somebody. Even worse, as she was dealing with poisoned daggers. Even a scratch of that would prove to be fatal. On top of that, there wasn't anybody watching her back. We didn't have Rejered here. We didn't have Rudeus here. She was on her own. She jumped into the fray without even a thought. And if it weren't for that knight jumping in when she did, she probably would have died. Something, once again, was never really technically mentioned in the anime. She nearly died. And she felt that, and again, was feeling the pressure of taking a life finally. Now again, honestly, from this point, I am still, once again, frustrated this isn't more of a first-person perspective of Eris. Not really getting into her mind and her thought process of what she's going through with now killing somebody. But even still, I do get a sense here that this is something that did bother her, in some sense. Keeping that all to herself, though, she sees her sword, apologizes to the knight, saying, "Sorry, one got away." This completely left this knight dumbfounded. This girl had just cut through a deadly group of killers, and yet it looked like she was unfazed. The knight pressed her fist against her stomach and bowed in the style of the Millis Holy Knights. "My sincerest thanks to you for your assistance." Remembering how Rejered typically responded to this, she made no bow, but said, "I'm glad the child's unharmed." The knight introduces herself as Therese Latria of the Temple Knights, which, yes, I know already who that is. I'm not going to talk about it now for those that are reading along with me. But she says, "I assume that you're an adventurer, miss. May I ask you your name?" And Eris about says, "I'm Eris," but she stops herself. She thinks about Rudeus and what he would do in this situation. "I am dead-end Rejered. Believe it or not, I am actually a superb," which under her helmet, this knight's face is taut. And Eris wasn't aware that the Temple Knights as a whole advocated for the expulsion of demonkind from this continent. But she kind of catched herself. The knight catched herself, realizing Eris is obviously lacking any of the features of a superb. It only took one look for Therese to really relax. Now here's a funny thing. And again, another thing that wasn't really noted in the anime. Therese believes that Eris gave a false name, assuming the identity of a demon that the Temple Knights would view in hostility. She figured this was a message that she had no interest in further involving herself in this affair. In other words, she didn't expect a reward, despite having saved somebody so important. So yeah, with this, Therese says, "I see. Very well then." Therese took a moment to kind of observe Eris, standing there with her arms folded and glaring. And she memorized her face and then whistled for her horse. Her horse arrives, she placed this child that she was protecting onto the horse and hops onto it behind her. And Therese says, "Should you ever find yourself in need of assistance, ask for Therese of the Temple Knights." And with that, she turns and leaves. Yes, leaves, and Cliff never shows up. Anime? I don't even know what they were thinking with the anime adaptation. For some reason, Cliff like shows up with a helmet on to disguise himself so that Therese and this blessed child doesn't know he is, and they all leave together. But no, in the novel, Cliff the entire time is behind the bushes and he's observing all this, and he's observing it and he's just completely blown away. Like, everything he's seen before him with Eris taking out all these guys and Therese, they were characters out of a fairy tale to him. And this is the point in which we really get a true past of Cliff himself, which again, I don't even recall being mentioned in the anime. It goes into mentioning that some time ago, a prelate of the Millis church fell in love with a woman of a halfling race. This woman bore him a child, and this boy grew up and took on a wife of his own. Cliff was their first and only child. Now, at the time of Cliff's birth, there was various factions within the church who were engaging in power struggles, and the violence itself cost him the life of both his parents. In order to keep Cliff safe, his grandfather, the prelate, temporarily left him at an orphanage in Milshan. His grandfather then triumphed over his enemies, and at that point took on the role of Pope, and then brought Cliff back into his household. In other words, Cliff Grimoire is the true grandson of the current Pope of Millis. Again, I may have missed it. Never seen that was actually mentioned. I do remember the anime was specifically saying that he was adopted by the Pope. I just don't remember them specifically saying he is the true grandson. He's not just an orphan. And it notes here that a few people within the church itself even know that this is a fact. But with all that said, and the back history there, and Cliff's involvement with the Pope and everything, this explains why Cliff knew exactly why that carriage was attacked. The blessed child was said to possess miraculous powers, and she was the most powerful tool in the arsenal of a certain archbishop, and that archbishop's faction is currently in conflict with Cliff's grandfather. Cliff has met this blessed child before. Admittedly, he had no clue what she was doing at that forest, but Cliff was also familiar with the assassins themselves. They were amongst Cliff's instructors. He had known that they'd carried out similar missions from his grandfather, but he also knew how powerful they were. It's why he knew that he wouldn't be able to take them on. But he didn't know that Eris could. He wasn't aware of how powerful Eris was. And yes, even Cliff here acknowledges they stood no chance against Eris. Even though from Eris's perspective, like we mentioned earlier, she did know it was a close call. If it weren't for that night, the fact they had, poisoned daggers, she nearly died. But from Cliff's perspective, literally, she overpowered them. So with all that said, they head back to town. The entire time, Cliff is just looking at Eris with admiration. Eventually, it just blurts out and comes to his mind, "Eris, will you marry me?" Which Eris quickly replies, "What? Not a chance." Shut it down instantly. It knows that yes, it's technically bizarre for any girl to ever deny his proposal. He was so talented, why would anybody? And he tried to search for some explanation. And he's thinking around, and he remembers, yeah, she keeps mentioning this tutor. It's gotta be him. What was his name? Rudeus? Eris immediately turns around at the sound of his name. That's your teacher's name, right? What is he like? And this just turns into like, you open the can of worms, dude. Eris just goes on and on about how amazing Rudeus is, all the stuff that she taught him, talking constantly proudly about everything he's ever done. In a way that she went on talking about him, it was like everything was a compliment. And every expression on her face, it was obvious. Her feelings were plain. It was so much to make Cliff deeply jealous. So he just kind of interrupts her as she's going on about this. "I'm heading home now." And she's like, "All right, later." She's like just giving off this like vague disinterest like in whatever he has to say and the fact that he's leaving. As she's kind of leaving out of view, he's like sitting there thinking about who is this Rudeus guy? Who is this guy that enchanted her mind? This beautiful, powerful, flawless girl. Who managed to enchant her with his like vision of like this mysterious rival floating above his head? And he returns back to the Millis church. He obviously receives some harsh talking to for, running off. Incidentally, kind of talks about the fact that, obviously following this whole situation that happened at the edge of this forest, this big power struggle happens quickly within the church. Because of this, the Pope soon would decide that it was too dangerous for Cliff to be here. And so he decides to have Cliff be sent off to live in a foreign land. So I'm starting to get like a similarity here. It's like every time we end up having a character run into somebody that's like in a super high position somewhere, at some point at the end of the story, they get shipped off. Sharoni. But no, then it cuts over to Eris very briefly talking about the fact that, yes, even though all this crazy stuff happened, the moment she gets back at the end, the moment that she sees Rudeus, like, just in distraught in his bed, she quickly forgets about all this stuff that happens, which they get into again later on in chapter 7, which I thought was kind of funny, this idea of, yeah, technically she ended up saving this blessed child with the Temple Knight against all these assassins, and the whole thing with Cliff, and going and just alone her doing Goblin Slaying. You'd think that would be something that she'd be like, Rudeus, you wouldn't believe what happened, which technically, yes, she does. When she first arrives, she's super excited, and he's like, wow, I'm glad that she had a good day. I had a fight with my father. It's gone. Like, it immediately leaves her mind the moment she sees how distraught he is, which again emphasizes how much Eris was truly broken and angry by how Rudeus looked. Rudeus never had that face for her before. Rudeus never looked that upset. He always shrugged things off. But this was something different, and it was enough that she completely forgot about everything that happened, and her sole focus was on, where is he at? I'm gonna kill him, pretty much. But yes, that's Eris the Goblin Slayer chapter, and as I kind of assumed, extremely long recording, so I'm gonna leave it there. Again, fantastic chapter overall. Again, I'm going to say it once more and never again, was very deeply saddened to see that it wasn't a first-person perspective of Eris herself and getting into her thought processes, but even still from a third-person perspective into Eris's mind, I think what this chapter really does tell me is how much Eris really does look up to the trainers that have been in her past. Ghislaine, Rudeus, Rudeus, every single one of them have instilled upon her training that she takes and holds true to. Every thought process she has is to her trainers and what they taught her, and she acts on every single one of them. She never thinks for herself. I think the only part that you really have in this entire episode is, yes, the fact that she wanted to do Goblin Slaying, obviously. But I think only the factor that she did punch Cliff, and yes, the fact that she went into the forest even though she was told not to. Everything else is calculative to what she's been taught. And I think that shows just how much admiration and trust she has to the people around her. Yes, I kind of mentioned the idea that I thought that Eris knew about the whole displacement thing because she figured it out. She thought it through. But again, it wasn't that far. It wasn't that she was thinking that much, because again, she trusts Rudeus. She trusts Rudeus to figure it out and then let her know how it goes, and then follow him. She is literally a true follower. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because you really do need somebody that's going to lead. If she was not a good follower, they would probably have a lot more conflicts, and she'd probably run off on her own in the middle of the night, run down in some labyrinth, and they would have some bad situation happen. Again, she goes by Rudeus's lead. She knows he's smart. She knows she's going to figure it out, and she's going to follow whatever orders he has. And I think that's to her credit. Again, she's matured. She's very smart in that regard. Yes, she blows up. Yes, she gets in fights, but she does think this stuff through. On the opposite end, yes, it's really good to see a lot more into Cliff Grimoire, despite the fact that in the anime, I didn't really like him. I still don't really like him. He's just full of himself. But I'm sure that he's probably going to be turning to a really pinnacle character later on. I think they put way too much emphasis on the fact that he's the grandchild of the Pope and all this kind of stuff, and the conflict itself and being shipped off. All that stuff's going to be super important. Definitely looking forward also to get more into detail on the Blessed Child. I think that was one of the interesting things that I found when watching the anime. Specifically when it got into like Zenobia and stuff, the whole aspect of the Blessed Child was really interesting to me, and I hope that as when we get into Shirone and all that kind of stuff, I'm really hoping that we'll get more into the Blessed Child and what all that stuff means. Again, it kind of just emphasizing the idea that they're really powerful, but hopefully they'll get more detail into what they are. But anyways, fantastic chapter. Really did love it. Looking forward to getting into Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is so good. I hope you guys are excited for the following episode as we get in Chapter 7. Again, I'm not going to get into it now because it's been going on too long, but yeah, Chapter 7, again, another one that is completely non-existent in the anime, so I hope you guys will look forward to that. More cut content, and I think it's extremely, extremely important stuff that I'm kind of at this point really mad they skipped, but that's for the next video. Hope you guys look forward to that. As always, I definitely appreciate your guys' support, checking out the video, leaving comments, leaving that like button. All that stuff helps me out to get in the algorithm, so even if you just go down there and say hi, that's enough for me. But again, I do love the feedback. I love people's kind words. It means so much to me. You guys are amazing. If you're new to the channel, I hope that you would subscribe to the channel so you get all my content. I do news, reviews, first impressions, top list. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. Additionally, you can check out my playlist where I have every single chapter all the way up to this point, as of now, covering the novel series as I continue to go through the entire novel series. Additionally, if you have the means to, I'd greatly appreciate if you consider supporting us on Patreon, our tips link, or super thanks button down below. I greatly appreciate everybody it does, and y'all take care.